I forced my stepmother Karen to sign away her entire life savings and her freedom while she thought she was winning a $10 million jackpot. By the time she realized the legal papers she was gloating over were actually a confession to federal crimes, it was already too late to stop the police from pulling into her driveway. My name is Sarah, and for 20 years I lived in the shadow of the most manipulative woman I have ever known. To understand how I ended up dismantling her life piece by piece, you have to understand the kind of person Karen was. She entered my father's life when I was 10 years old, just 2 years after my mother passed away. At first, she played the role of the sweet, grieving widow-to-be, but the moment the wedding ring was on her finger, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Karen was the definition of entitled. She didn't just want the best of everything. She believed that if someone else had something nice, it was a personal insult to her. She grew up in a modest home, but acted like she was displaced royalty. My father, Mike, was a brilliant engineer who had spent 30 years building a specialized manufacturing company from the ground up. He was a kind, quiet man who just wanted peace at home, which Karen used to her absolute advantage. She spent money like it was water, but only on herself. I remember one Christmas when I was 14, my father had bought me a laptop I needed for school. Karen threw a literal tantrum, screaming that it was unfair for a child to have a more expensive gift than her. She forced my father to return it and instead bought herself a designer handbag that cost 3 times as much. I ended up doing my homework on a library computer for a year while she paraded that bag around like a trophy. Her entitlement extended to how she treated anyone she deemed beneath her. If a waiter brought the wrong side dish, she wouldn't just send it back. She would lecture them on their lack of education and demand to see a manager to get them fired. She once made a teenage cashier at a grocery store cry because a coupon had expired, claiming the girl was trying to rob her of $5. My father was often too tired from work to fight her, so he would just apologize and pay for whatever she wanted to keep the house quiet. But Karen's ultimate goal wasn't just luxury items or making service workers miserable. She wanted the company. She saw my father's business as her personal piggy bank and resented every hour he spent making sure the employees were taken care of. She would frequently show up at the office demanding that the accounting department cut her checks for personal vacations, calling them business expenses. When the head accountant, a loyal man named Dave, who had been with my father for 20 years, refused to bypass the rules, Karen made it her mission to destroy him. She started rumors that Dave was stealing, and when that didn't work, she harassed him so badly that he eventually retired early just to get away from her. As my father's health began to decline, Karen's behavior shifted from annoying to predatory. She started isolating him from his friends, and even from me. She would tell him I was too busy to visit, while telling me that he was too tired for company. I caught her once whispering in his ear while he was heavily medicated, telling him that I only cared about his money and that she was the only one who truly loved him. It was sickening to watch. She was a vulture circling a man who wasn't even gone yet. She replaced all the household staff with people she hired personally, people who wouldn't report back to me or my father's lawyers about what was happening inside the house. The worst part was her arrogance. She truly believed she was the smartest person in any room. She would brag to her socialite friends about how she had Mike wrapped around her finger and how she was going to be the queen of the city once he was gone. She didn't hide her contempt for me at all. She would look me in the eye and tell me that I would be lucky if she left me enough money to buy a bus ticket out of town. She was so confident in her ability to manipulate my father that she stopped being careful. She started moving small amounts of money out of his personal accounts into offshore holdings, thinking no one would notice because she was the one handling the mail. She didn't realize that my father was much sharper than he let on, even in his final months. He knew exactly what kind of person he had married, and he knew that the moment he passed, she would try to erase me from the family legacy. What Karen didn't know was that while she was busy picking out black dresses for a funeral she couldn't wait to attend, my father and I were having secret meetings in the middle of the night to set a trap that would take years to fully spring. She thought she was the predator, but she was about to walk into a cage of her own making. The day my father passed away was the day Karen finally stopped pretending to be human. He had been gone for less than 6 hours when I arrived at the family house, my heart heavy with grief, only to find the locks had already been changed. I stood on the porch, trembling with exhaustion and sorrow, ringing the doorbell until Karen finally opened it. She didn't offer a hug or a word of comfort. She stood there in a silk robe, holding a glass of expensive wine, and told me that the house was now her private property and that I was trespassing. When I told her I just wanted to get my mother's old photo albums and a few personal items from my childhood bedroom, she laughed in my face. She told me that everything inside those 4 walls belonged to her now, and that if I didn't leave immediately, she would call the police and tell them I was trying to assault her. I tried to reason with her, reminding her that I had grown up there, but she simply blew a puff of cigarette smoke in my direction and slammed the door. That was the first incident that told me this wasn't just going to be a cold relationship, it was going to be a war. A week later, we had the reading of the will. I expected a fair distribution, as my father had told me many times that the company and the house were to be split. But when the lawyer, a man Karen had personally selected to replace my father's longtime attorney, started reading, my blood ran cold. He produced a document dated only 3 months prior, signed while my father was on heavy pain medication and barely lucid. This new will left 95% of the entire estate to Karen. It gave her the house, the vacation properties, and most importantly, the controlling interest in the tech company. I was left with a small cash sum that wouldn't even cover the taxes on the inheritance. I sat there in stunned silence while Karen sat across from me, dabbing fake tears with a lace handkerchief that probably cost more than my car. When the lawyer finished, she leaned over the table and whispered that I should be grateful she didn't have my father disinherit me entirely for being such an ungrateful daughter. I tried to keep my voice steady, asking her if we could sit down and talk about the company's future, as I had worked in the marketing department for 5 years and knew the staff. She simply stood up, looked at me with pure venom, and said that my employment was terminated effective immediately. She told me to have my desk cleared by the end of the day, or she would have security throw my belongings into the dumpster. I went to the office, hoping to find some shred of decency, but Karen had already called ahead. When I arrived, 2 security guards I didn't recognize were waiting at the entrance. They escorted me to my cubicle like I was a common criminal. My coworkers, people I had known for years, watched in horrified silence. Karen herself showed up 10 minutes later, parading through the office in a bright red dress that screamed celebration rather than mourning. She walked straight to my desk and picked up a small glass paperweight that had been my mother's. She looked at it for a second and then intentionally dropped it on the hard floor, watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces. She told me that she was cleaning out the trash, starting with me. I didn't scream or cry. I just knelt down, picked up the largest shard of glass, and put it in my bag. I told her that my father wouldn't have wanted this, and she leaned down and hissed that my father was a weak man who was finally out of her way. She then announced to the entire office that anyone caught speaking to me or helping me would be fired on the spot. The third and most vicious incident happened a month later. I was staying in a small apartment, trying to gather my thoughts and consult with a new lawyer, when I received a legal notice. Karen was suing me. She claimed that during my time working at the company, I had embezzled over $50,000 in company funds. It was a complete fabrication, but she had used her new power as owner to manufacture a paper trail. She had her hand-picked accountants create fake invoices and expense reports with my forged signature. She called me that night, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She told me that she wasn't content with just taking my inheritance. She wanted to make sure I was so buried in legal fees and criminal charges that I would never be able to work in this industry again. She offered me a deal. If I signed a document renouncing any right to challenge the will and agreed to leave the state forever, she would drop the fake charges. She told me I had 48 hours to decide, or she would go to the district attorney. I spent that night sitting on the floor of my apartment, looking at the broken shard of my mother's paperweight. The level of her cruelty was staggering. She wasn't just stealing my money, she was trying to erase my very existence and reputation. I realized then that trying to play nice with a monster was a losing game. Every time I reached out an olive branch, she used it to strike me. She thought she had me backed into a corner, a broken, grieving daughter with no resources. She didn't realize that I had been recording every single one of our phone calls since the day of the funeral. She didn't know that my father had given me a small USB drive 2 weeks before he died, with instructions to only open it if Karen proved to be as heartless as he feared. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. I wasn't going to sign her document. I wasn't going to leave the state. I was going to let her believe she was winning, let her get comfortable in her stolen throne, and then I was going to take everything back with interest. I called her back and, in my best trembling voice, told her I needed more time to think. She laughed and told me she loved hearing me beg. Little did she know, that was the last time she would ever have the upper hand. The turning point came on what would have been my parents' 30th wedding anniversary. I'd spent the morning at the cemetery, placing flowers on their shared plot and trying to find the strength to keep fighting Karen's relentless legal assault. When I returned to my small apartment, I found the front door hanging off its hinges. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped inside, fearing a burglary. But what I found was much more calculated and cruel. The apartment had been ransacked, but nothing of high monetary value was missing. Instead, Karen had sent someone to destroy the only things I had left of my life before her. My mother's wedding dress, which I had kept in a sealed box under my bed, had been shredded into ribbons. My father's collection of handwritten journals, which contained 30 years of his thoughts and designs, had been dumped into the bathtub and soaked until the ink was an illegible blue smear. But the final straw was my dog, Buster. Buster was a senior golden retriever who had been my father's constant companion during his illness. After the funeral, Karen had dumped him at a high-kill shelter across the state line without telling me. It had taken me weeks to track him down and bring him to my apartment. When I walked into the bathroom, I saw Buster cowering in the corner, shaking and whimpering. He had been sprayed with some kind of harsh chemical cleaner that was burning his skin. I spent the next 6 hours at an emergency vet clinic crying as they treated his chemical burns and gave him sedatives. While I sat in that waiting room, something inside me finally snapped. I had tried to be the bigger person. I had tried to use mediation. I had tried to appeal to whatever shred of humanity Karen might have had left. But as I looked at my traumatized, elderly dog and thought about my mother's ruined dress, I realized that Karen wasn't just a greedy woman. She was a parasite that wouldn't stop until she had consumed every beautiful memory I had left. That night, I went home and plugged in the USB drive my father had given me. I had been afraid to look at it, fearing it would just be more words of grief. But what I found was a tactical roadmap for total destruction. My father had known Karen was forging documents and skimming money for years. He had stayed with her because he was too ill to fight a divorce, but he had spent his final months acting as a double agent in his own home. The drive contained a hidden folder titled For Sarah Only. Inside were high-resolution scans of his original, authentic will, which he had signed and notarized in secret with a different law firm. There were also records of a secret bank account he had set up in my name years ago, filled with nearly $1 million that Karen never knew existed. But the most devastating piece of evidence was a series of recorded conversations between Karen and her lawyer, where they openly discussed the plan to drug my father and force him to sign the fake will. I realized then that Karen's greatest weakness was her own arrogance. She was so convinced she had won that she was becoming sloppy. She was currently in the process of trying to sell my father's company to a competitor for a massive, quick payout, a move that would leave hundreds of long-term employees jobless. I knew that if I just went to the police with the will, she might find a way to tie it up in court for years using the money she had stolen. I didn't want a long court battle. I wanted her to lose everything in a single, catastrophic moment. I wanted her to feel the same cold, hollow terror she had inflicted on me. I spent the next 3 days in a dark room fueled by caffeine and pure, cold rage. I contacted the forensic accountant who had worked with my father in secret, a woman named Sarah who had been waiting for my call. We began mapping out Karen's financial crimes. It turned out she hadn't just been skimming, she had been using the company to launder money for a local real estate developer who was under federal investigation. Karen thought she was being clever, but she was actually the fall girl for a much larger criminal enterprise. My father had documented every single illegal transaction she had authorized. I decided to play the ultimate long game. I called Karen and told her I was defeated. I told her I would sign the papers to renounce my inheritance and leave the state if she would just give me one final meeting at the house to collect my father's remaining ashes, which she had refused to give me. I made my voice sound small, broken, and desperate. She laughed, her voice full of triumph, and told me to come over the following Friday evening. She told me she was having a victory party to celebrate the sale of the company and that I could pick up the ashes from the mudroom like the servant I was. As I hung up the phone, I didn't feel sad. I felt a strange, electric calm. I wasn't going to that house to collect ashes. I was going there to light a metaphorical fuse. I had already sent the encrypted files to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had also contacted the board of directors of the company that was planning to buy my father's business, providing them with proof that the assets they were buying were tied to money laundering. The trap was set. Karen was planning a party to celebrate her ultimate victory, but she was actually hosting her own downfall. I looked at the shard of my mother's glass paperweight that I still carried in my purse. The edge was sharp, just like the plan I had set in motion. Karen wanted to play at being a villain, but she was about to find out that I was my father's daughter, and I had learned from the best how to build something that lasts and how to dismantle something that doesn't belong. The preparation for Karen's downfall required the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. I spent the next 2 weeks living in a world of spreadsheets, legal statutes, and encrypted emails. My first task was to ensure that the $1 million my father had left me stayed completely invisible. I moved the funds through a series of protected trusts that even Karen's high-priced lawyers couldn't track. This was my war chest. With it, I hired a private security firm staffed by former federal agents and a top-tier digital forensics team. I didn't just want to prove she forged a will, I wanted to prove she was a systematic criminal.
The digital forensics team managed to gain remote access to the home security system Karen had installed. She had chosen a high-end system with cameras and microphones in every room to keep tabs on the servants, never realizing that the default administrator password had never been changed. For 10 days, I watched her. I watched her drink vintage wine from my mother's crystal glasses and heard her laugh with her lawyer, Dave, about how easy it had been to gaslight my father. I recorded every second of it. In one particularly damning video, she stood in the study, holding my father's original will. I watched through a grainy lens as she fed the pages into a paper shredder, laughing as the physical proof of my inheritance turned into confetti. She thought she was destroying the only copy. She didn't know my father had hidden 3 more in safety deposit boxes across 3 different states, with the keys mailed to me in a package she never intercepted.
Next, I focused on the company sale. Karen was trying to rush a $10 million acquisition by a firm called Global Ventures. I contacted their lead counsel anonymously, providing just enough information to trigger a mandatory red flag in their compliance department. I told them that the company's intellectual property was tied up in a pending estate dispute and that any purchase would result in an immediate freeze of assets. This didn't stop the sale, but it forced them to move the closing date to the night of Taryn's victory party. They demanded the signing happen in person, at the house, with a court reporter present to verify the validity of the documents. This was exactly what I needed. I then turned my attention to the money laundering. My father's files showed that Karen had been using the company's shipping manifests to move illicit cash for a developer named Mr. Henderson. I didn't go to the local police, as Henderson had friends in the department. Instead, I went to the federal authorities. I presented them with a silver platter of evidence, bank account numbers, dates of transfers, and the recorded conversations where Karen bragged about her side business. I told the federal agents that a massive cash transfer was scheduled to take place during her party, disguised as a payment for a piece of art she was selling to Henderson. The agents agreed to wait until the night of the party to move in, wanting to catch both of them in the act of exchanging the funds. To ensure Karen felt the full weight of the blow, I contacted every prominent socialite and business leader in the city. I leaked a rumor that the party wasn't just a celebration, but a historic announcement where Karen would be giving away massive charitable grants. This ensured that the house would be packed with the very people whose respect Karen craved most. I wanted her shame to have an audience. I wanted the elite circle she had clawed her way into to see her in handcuffs. The final piece of the trap was the legal finishing move. I had my lawyers prepare a massive civil lawsuit for wrongful death, elder abuse, and fraud. But we didn't file it yet. We waited until 4 hours before the party started. I had a process server dressed as a catering waiter, ready to hand-deliver the summons in front of the Global Ventures executives. As the sun set on the day of the party, I sat in a van 2 blocks away from my childhood home, surrounded by monitors and federal agents. I watched the live feed as the house filled with people in tuxedos and evening gowns. Karen was at the center of it all, wearing a diamond necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. She looked radiant and utterly untouchable. She was holding court in the grand ballroom, telling everyone how she had single-handedly saved the company after my father's tragic passing. She looked at the clock, clearly eager for the Global Ventures team to arrive so she could sign the final papers and claim her $10 million. I felt no hesitation. I felt no pity. I reached out and touched the screen, tracing the outline of the house that should have been a place of love, but had become a monument to her greed. I looked at the lead federal agent and gave him a short, sharp nod. It was time. I told him that the court reporter had just entered the study and that the Global Ventures executives were opening their briefcases. Karen was walking toward them, a pen in her hand and a predatory smile on her face. She thought she was signing her way into a life of permanent luxury. In reality, she was about to sign a document that my team had digitally swapped for a full confession of her financial crimes, hidden within 60 pages of fine print that her ego would never allow her to read. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on the end of Karen's world. The climax of the night was more perfect than I ever could have imagined. I walked into the house through the kitchen entrance wearing a simple black dress, unnoticed by the hundreds of guests laughing and drinking my father's expensive scotch. I made my way to the hallway just outside the study, where the heavy oak doors were closed for the final signing. Inside were the executives from Global Ventures, Karen, her crooked lawyer Dave, and the court reporter. I stood there for a moment, listening to Karen's voice. She was laughing, telling the executives that it was a shame my father wasn't there to see his company finally being put into professional hands. That was the moment I pushed the doors open. The room went silent. Karen's face turned a shade of purple I didn't know was possible. She started to scream at me, demanding to know how I got past security and calling for the guards to throw me out. I didn't say a word. I just walked over to the table and laid down the original, notarized will that my father had hidden. I told the Global Ventures executives that the woman they were dealing with didn't actually own the shares she was trying to sell. At that exact moment, the process server I had hired stepped forward from the corner of the room where he had been waiting and handed Karen a thick stack of legal papers. He told her she was being served in a civil suit for $50 million for fraud, elder abuse, and the wrongful death of my father. Karen ripped the papers out of his hand and threw them at me, screaming that I was a pathetic loser who couldn't accept that I had been cut out. She turned to the executives and told them to ignore me, grabbing the pen to sign the sale agreement. She scribbled her name on the final page of the contract, slamming the pen down and looking at me with pure triumph. She told me it was over and that she was now a very wealthy woman while I was nothing. I smiled at her, and it was the first genuine smile I had felt in a year. I told her to look at the document she had just signed. My team had used a digital overlay on the tablet she used for the final signature page. She hadn't signed a sale agreement. She had just signed a voluntary surrender of all assets to the estate's rightful heir and a full admission of knowledge regarding the offshore accounts. Before she could even process what I had said, the front doors of the mansion were kicked open. A team of 12 federal agents in tactical gear flooded into the ballroom, shouting for everyone to stay still. The music cut out, replaced by the screams of the panicked socialites. The lead agent walked straight into the study, followed by 2 officers with handcuffs. He looked at Karen and told her she was under arrest for money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit forgery. Karen tried to run toward the private safe behind the desk, likely trying to grab the cash she had hidden there, but she was tackled to the floor before she could even get close. I watched as they pulled her up, her expensive designer dress torn and her hair a mess. She was sobbing now, but they weren't the fake tears she had used at the funeral. These were tears of genuine, pathetic terror. She started screaming that it was all Dave's fault, pointing at her lawyer. Dave, seeing the ship sinking, immediately told the agents that he would testify against her in exchange for a plea deal. As they led her through the ballroom in handcuffs, past the very people she had spent years trying to impress, the silence was deafening. Her high society friends didn't step forward to help her. They pulled away, some of them even filming the arrest on their phones. She had spent her whole life building a facade of power, and it crumbled in less than 10 minutes. The fallout was total. The investigation into the money laundering led the FBI to Mr. Henderson, who was arrested that same night. Because Karen had signed that final document, the company assets were immediately frozen and then returned to my control as the rightful executor of the true will. I spent the next 6 months firing every person Karen had hired and bringing back the loyal staff she had pushed out, including Dave the accountant, who came out of retirement to help me fix the books. We found that Karen had stolen nearly $4 million over the years, all of which was seized from her personal accounts to pay back the company. Today, Karen is serving a 15-year sentence in a federal prison. She lost the house, the cars, the jewelry, and every cent she ever took. Because of the nature of her crimes, she was also ordered to pay massive restitution, meaning even if she ever gets out, she will be broke for the rest of her life. Her socialite friends have completely erased her from their lives, and she spends her days in a gray cell, a far cry from the silk sheets she stole from my father. I moved back into my childhood home and restored it to exactly how it looked when my mother was alive. My dog, Buster, is fully recovered and spends his afternoons napping in the sunny spot in my father's old study. Sometimes I look at the shard of glass for my mother's paperweight, which I had set into a new gold necklace. It reminds me that some things can be broken, but they can also be forged into something much sharper. Karen thought she could steal a legacy by tearing a family apart, but she forgot one simple rule of engineering that my father taught me. If you want to take down a structure, you have to understand exactly how it was built. And I knew exactly which pillars to pull to make her entire world come crashing down on her head. I hope you enjoyed this story.